Hi, I'm Phil Noble with Envision, South Carolina, and we're here in Columbia today to talk to Dr. Lacy K. Ford, Vice Provost at the USC and a former Chairman of the History Department. Welcome to Envision, South Carolina, Lacy.
Yes, glad to be with you today, Phil.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about your first sort of being cognizant of South Carolina as kind of a different place as you were growing older and some sense of understanding our uniqueness, if you will.
I think actually my first cognizance of the importance of the state's history, at least, was actually when I was a fairly young person growing up in a rural community in South Carolina near a small textile town, but within a 20-mile driving distance of Charlotte. The difference of cultures between a small community that was still heavily devoted to farming and textiles and a city with skyscrapers and big department stores, and even though Charlotte wasn't then what it is today. And I wondered how did this happen? How did you get from my small community to Charlotte in a short period of time, really? And I thought, the significance of that transformation is important to understand. And
Where was it? Where'd you grow up?
grew up in York County near the town of Clover, outside.
Near Clover,
Near
suburban
four
Clover.
miles outside, 4 miles from the main intersection in Clover, South Carolina, and about 25 miles from the intersection of Trade and Tryon Street, near what is today the Bank of America Tower.
Right, fascinating. And then you went to school here?
Went to, got all of my education at the University of South Carolina. Very proud alumni of the university. Got my bachelor's and PhD in history at the university. Taught at the University of California for a year and have been a faculty member and administrator at the university ever since, and have been very fortunate in my career.
Part of the premise of Envision South Carolina is that South Carolina's unique history, particularly the fact of our prominence globally in the colonial days, has shaped our history, and that it is because we have been world-class before, if you will, that we can do it again. Talk a little bit about how South Carolina was world-class in those early days.
Well, South Carolina, like some other portions of the world in the 18th, 19th century, were able to ride some of the great staple crop booms that occurred in the world. Particularly rice was the first great economic engine of South Carolina, beginning in the 1720s and lasting for another 150 years or so. Enormous fortunes were made off rice along the coast in the Low Country. These enormous fortunes were made possible by the very large numbers of slaves that were purchased and imported to work in the very dangerous rice fields. The second big engine, economic engine in the state was the cotton boom, which began in the 1790s. And you had booms on and off in the cotton economy down as far as the 1950s. In both cases, and again, while the story of cotton is more mixed, there were large numbers of slaves used, of course, in the production of cotton. Those early booms were really driven by the emergence of world markets, which South Carolina participated in very vigorously and very profitable for the owners. And but at the same time, they were not economic engines that required positioning the society for a strong economy in the long term. They were very much dependent upon the success of rice and the success of cotton, just like some Middle Eastern economies today are very dependent upon oil. If oil ceases to become valuable, Saudi Arabia ceases to become wealthy. It's not clear that they're well positioned to make their transition into anything else. I think South Carolina had a less significant, but still 100 years worth of kind of commitment to the textile industry, which didn't bring in the type of wealth that the earlier agricultural booms have, but did become a critical contributor to the economy. That too did not, as important as it was, did not necessarily leave the state particularly well prepared as for economic change, to transition out of that particular economy into another one. And I think, it's a cliche that change is inevitable, but if you want to have economic success in the long term, you really have to prepare for it. And I think that's something that South Carolina has not done as well as it could have, in part because it succumbed to the temptation of what's at hand. Let's do what's easiest to do, what makes us the most money the quickest, and not to be concerned about sort of preparing the society as a whole for durable economic success.
Just how rich and prosperous and distinctive was South Carolina, both in that colonial period and then later up until the Civil War era that we've talked about before?
On the eve of the American Revolution, 11 of the 12 wealthiest counties in the soon-to-be United States were in the state of South Carolina, and they were rice-producing areas along the South Carolina coast. In the 1790s and the first two decades of the 1800s, probably the greatest center of wealth creation in the entire United States was in Abbeville and Edgefield and Richland counties in South Carolina, where the cotton boom was taking off, and people were coming from really all over the country and world to see how these great fortunes were being made in cotton production.
You're saying that we have to, instead of yielding to the short-term temptation of trying to find the way, we've got to invest long-term in human capital in this state. What are the sort of historic barriers and the current barriers to our doing that?
Historically, I think it's because the state has really rather explicitly been committed to the success of some of its citizens, but not all of its citizens. This, of course, refers to a long-time reliance on slavery as a labor system and the continued system of segregation and disfranchisement of African Americans from the end of the Civil War down into the 1960s. For much of that time, African Americans were half the state's population. They're now about a third of the population. We have to be committed to opportunity for everyone, regardless of race or place or economic background. You have to work harder to give everybody an opportunity. It may digress a bit from your question, but I remember being about 12 years old and asking my father why he was interested in politics, and his answer was, I'm not really interested in elections and campaigning. I'm interested in what you can use it to do. And I said, well, what can you use it to do? And he says, you can use it to get roads paved and electricity in rural areas. These are dated concepts now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You can use it to help people get jobs. You can use it to make sure they got a decent school to send their kids to and a different hospital to go to when they get sick. And I said to him, well, that ought to be easy. That's something everybody wants. And he looked at me and he said, everybody wants it, but too many people don't care whether other people have it too. And I think that pretty much sums it up. If we're committed to opportunity and progress across the board, it's something we can have. As long as it's something where we want a clear path to it for ourselves but don't much care what happens to anybody else, it's going to be hard to get there. I know that addresses a deep question about human nature, but I think there's also broad religious traditions in the state that suggest that there should be no least and last that are left behind, and I hope we could tap into that sentiment in the non-religious world and develop a commitment to preparing the entire society to endure the inevitable economic turmoil and change that is going to happen. Rice was successful for a very long time. Cotton was something people could live off of for a very long time, but it was only really successful for 20 or 30 years. What if we had been the center of laptop computer manufacturing in the 1990s? Well, it's only 2012 now, and already that's not the cutting edge of the business.
Right.
You've got to be prepared to make transitions. And so therefore I think committing to human capital is the only option. Other portions of the country have done a better job than we have, and they're profiting more from it. The fact that we did not have high levels of human capital left us more vulnerable to global competition that we've lost a lot of jobs to. It's one thing to complain about those jobs, and maybe things happened in the loss of those jobs that wasn't always fair. But it's also just absolutely true that those kind of things are going to happen, and you have to put yourself in a position that you can adapt. I would say adaptability is a key to the state's future.
You talked about our state's faith tradition, if you will, that we have long had deep and wide religious commitments among our people. And you talked about how that can be an asset in overcoming this past and investing in human capital. What are the other aspects of our state, the things that are special and unusual that can be assets in that long-term process?
I do think to a striking degree for the early 20th, first century South Carolinians, whether they're native South Carolinians or newcomers who've arrived in the state, have a fairly strong sense of community identity. They identify with where they are, where they live, maybe where they grew up. I think that strong sense of community can generate a strong desire to give back to that community. I think we have communities in the state, including some of our larger cities, which are significantly different from each other, and we sometimes perceive that as a problem, that there's too much competition between the Charleston area, the Columbia area, the Greenville-Spartan area, Berg area. But there really are different types of communities, and they provide an array of options for people in terms of lifestyle, for terms of the nature of the local economy, for terms of location. And I think that is certain. I think that that amount of sort of geographical, demographical diversity within a fairly small space is really can be a strength if we would learn how to play it as a strength instead of as a source of internal rivalries. I think we need to realize, as a small state that lags behind the nation in many indicators, we don't need to be internally divisive, but we need to pull together all of the resources and strengths we have.
You know, I think that's a really interesting observation, because we do think of our state as being very regionalized with regional competitions. But if you sort of flip that on its head and say it's not the regions, it's the communities, then it's about diversity, then it's about differences, and then it's about each one being special as opposed to that sort of competition. Talk about how that, within the political context, you've been involved in all sorts of political things. How does the political character of our state help or hurt what we need to do in terms of building that human capital?
I do think that it's possible to, if you have a strong sense of your own identity, you're more willing to cooperate at times. And so therefore I think the fact that we can be a deeply rooted people could be a source of strength. I do think that in terms of the political system of the state, it tends to encourage fragmentation and polarization rather than taking a broad view. This has been the advent of single-member districts in the state legislature, beginning a process that began in the 1970s and was kind of completed in the 1990s, has certainly made the legislature a somewhat more diverse place, and it made sure that portions of the community which were underrepresented have some representation. But at the same time, it has made the legislature a place where there are very few people that can rise above the interest of their district to tend to the interest of the entire state. And it tends to be a legislature that's full of safe seats for one side or the other. It's full of seats that are pretty safe, at least in the general election, and the only thing you have to do is make sure your base is happy so you don't get a challenge in the primary. This tends to accentuate differences in the state and not promote cooperation. at least on a daily basis. Another thing that I think is not peculiar to the state, but the state has been victimized to an extent. One of the things that you would not have expected as means of communication has diversified is news is available 24/7 and everybody can be on the internet
Right.
and look things up, is that we're in a kind of a constant campaign mode. Everybody is running for office every day of every year for
Right.
however long their term is, and there's no time for governing. Everything is about making a campaign statement with where you stand. This has always been true to a degree. I'm not trying to sugarcoat the past, but right now it is just you're suffocating with the taking of positions, and not so much with the working, trying to work things out. How you change that, I'm not exactly sure. Historians are not always the best prognosticators, but we need to take a hard look at that and see how we could tinker around with our system and maybe improve that aspect of it.
Are you optimistic about our ability to change and do the kinds of things you outlined, or are we sort of condemned to our current bottom of the list status?
I think I'm optimistic because I don't think it's going to be easy, and I probably don't think we're going to see a turnaround overnight. But I think if you look at the changes that are occurring in the state, if you look at the attitudes of the state's younger population, of its under 40 population, of its under 45 population, as the population of the state does become more diverse in many ways, as we have
Right.
more different ethnic groups coming in, people coming in from all over the country, all over the world. I feel like that some of the fear of change and some of the determination to stick to traditional ways, whether they have been effective or not, will diminish, and you're going to have a more flexible, adaptable sort of people, sort of population as a whole. So that makes me optimistic. And I'm also optimistic because a lot of the things that we don't have, like a lot of actual capital, a lot of investment capital being owned and controlled by South Carolinians, which was a huge problem for the state for 100 years. Now, capital markets flow. If you have a good idea, money
Right.
will come to you. So we can overcome some of those things if we do. I also see in the state's business and economic development community these days a lot of very interesting activities going on to try to improve the state's economy. They are not as well coordinated and haven't had maybe the political impact that they would have had 30 years ago. But there's work going on, and I have to believe that'll pay off in time.
You talked about the young people, and you're a college professor. You spend your time with late teens and early 20s. Some man or woman at that age came up to you and said, I'm dedicated to South Carolina's future. What should I do? What can I do to make that long-term difference? What do you tell them?
I would say prepare yourself as best you can. You get the best education you can, do whatever other preparation that you need to do. But long term, thinking about staying in the state and making that contribution here. Don't take your talents elsewhere. You may have to sacrifice a little bit in some ways to do that, but if you want, prepare yourself and then stay and give back. Think about what people have probably sacrificed, people who may not even know you very well, to enable you to achieve what you've achieved, and try to help others do that. That's not unique to South Carolina, but I think that's the appeal that we have to have. We don't want to lose our best and brightest young people to better opportunities elsewhere. I would also tell everybody else who's not a young person today to take note. The generation of college students that I deal with now is certainly different than when I'm a college student. They have so much access to information to knowledge. You can look it up on the internet, you can look it up on your phone. You finding the information is not hard. Knowing how to think about it and how to use it and how to be creative with it is the challenge. And we've got to strike a better balance between the notion that our job as educators is to make knowledge and information available to we've got to teach people how to think about the information they can find, how to use it, how to be creative with it, how to apply it in a context. That's going to be a fairly dramatic transformation in the world of education, K through 12, higher education. Well, it's happening now on a very piecemeal, ad hoc basis. We need to get more systematic with it. But you're going to have a group of people who come out who need to be differently educated than we were. It's always hard. You think, man, this was the way I had it. This is the way what I did, and it worked okay for me. But really, it's not what appeals to our students today.
Looking at this sort of broader sweep of South Carolina history, it seems that this period from after World War II to the mid-'80s has been sort of pivotal in our progression in this state. What has made that different? How has that been able to sustain us, or where did we fall short?
I think as we look back to the state's history for a period that would be instructive about how we ought to try to move forward, we need to look at that period from about 1940 through about 1985. It was during that period that we actually converged on national norms in terms of standard of living. Per capita income in South Carolina was about 50% of the national average in 1940. It had moved up to about 80% by 1985. It's still stuck around 80% of the national average more than a quarter of a century later. We've stopped converging. We didn't fall backwards, but we stopped gaining. I think it was during that period that the state underwent the most rapid economic change in the most sure-footed fashion. We were 40% agricultural in 1940. By 1985, we were 2% agricultural in terms of occupation. The level of industrialization tripled in that period. It diversified out of pure textiles, beginning to move toward other industries. We committed ourselves to education in a way we had before. We increased spending. We ultimately, of course, desegregated schools and committed to, or at least made steps toward equal opportunity for everybody in terms of public education. We were committed to public education. We raised our levels of commitment several times. We created the technical education system. We began to take our public universities and make them into research universities as well as teaching universities. We took a couple of additional schools into the state higher education system. We developed a fairly sophisticated operation in what was then the State Development Board, now the Department of Commerce, for recruiting businesses from the outside, and we upgraded the level of human services in the state to make outsiders willing to move in and to know that if members of their family had disability or needed health care, they could find the right services here. That was the right approach. We still had a vulnerability to competition. We were still dependent a lot on relatively low wage labor for our economic success rather than high skilled labor and high thought endeavors. And so when the rapid globalization of the economy began, it undermined some of our success. We've participated in it. We market fairly well, a number of businesses do in the world economy, but we lost a lot of jobs as that happened. So we didn't cover all of our bases, but we were headed in the right direction. I don't think that we have as clear a sense of direction as today as we did during that time period.
Why did we lose it? I mean, what happened in the mid-'80s that caused us to lose our focus and take our eye off the ball, so to speak?
I think several things happened. One is I think that success sometimes leads to its own problems, and I think we were so successful with the strategy we had, which was essentially to recruiting higher wage manufacturing businesses than we had previously had. We failed to note that the next boom areas of the economy were probably going to not be in manufacturing. So we were not terribly well positioned as the high technology and information economies took hold to be leaders in that. And it partly is because we were having so much success, and we continued to have success and
Right.
still do today in that area. But that can't be the only thing you do. And the other thing is that I think globalization just happened much faster than we anticipated, and
Right.
that drain was quicker and stronger than we imagined it to be. But I also think that the spirit of political cooperation that existed in that period, we had some very strong political leaders from both political parties in that period, uh, has been a factor as well, and it's just something you have to factor in. Envision, South Carolina, world-class, globally connected. How did this happen? How did you get from my small community to Charlotte in a short period of time, really? And I thought, the significance of that transformation is important to understand. And as
Where was it? Where'd you grow up?
grew up in York County near the town of Clover, outside.
Near Clover,
Near
suburban
four
Clover.
miles outside, 4 miles from the main intersection in Clover, South Carolina, and about 25 miles from the intersection of Trade and Tryon Street, near what is today Actually, my first cognizance of the importance of the state's history, at least, was actually when I was a fairly young person growing up in a rural community in South Carolina near a small textile town, but within a 20-mile driving distance of Charlotte. The difference of cultures between a small community that was still heavily devoted to farming and textiles and a city with skyscrapers and big department stores, and even though Charlotte wasn't then what it is today. And I wondered, how did this...
Hi, I'm Phil Noble with Envision, South Carolina, and we're here in Columbia today to talk to Dr. Lacy K. Ford, Vice Provost at the USC and a former Chairman of the History Department. Welcome to Envision, South Carolina, Lacy.
Yes, glad to be with you today, Phil.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about your first sort of being cognizant of South Carolina as kind of a different place, as you were growing older, and some sense of understanding our uniqueness, if you will.
I think Bank of America Tower.
Right. Fascinating. And then you went to school here?
Got all of my education at the University of South Carolina. Very proud alumni of the university. Got my bachelor's and PhD in history at the university. Taught at the University of California for a year, and have been a faculty member and administrator at the university ever since, and have been very fortunate in my career.
Part of the premise of Envision South Carolina is that South Carolina's unique history, particularly the fact of our prominence globally in the colonial days, has shaped our history, and that it is because we have been world-class before, if you will, that we can do it again. Talk a little bit about how South Carolina was world-class in those early days.
Well, South Carolina, like some other portions of the world in the 18th, 19th century, were able to ride some of the great staple crop booms that occurred in the world, particularly